Gray Hollow was the kind of town where nights were quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. Tucked between low hills and a slow, winding river, it had fewer than 10,000 residents and even fewer surprises. People locked their doors out of habit, not fear. Children rode their bikes until sunset. Everyone knew everyone, or at least pretended they did. Nothing truly terrible ever seemed to happen there. Until that winter night. Snow had started falling just before dusk, soft and steady, covering the streets in a thin white layer. Street lights glowed dimly through the snowfall, and by midnight the town felt sealed off from the rest of the world. Most houses were dark, families asleep, televisions muted, fireplaces slowly dying out. Only one house on Older Street still showed signs of life. Daniel Mercer's house stood at the end of the block, slightly older than the rest, with peeling paint and tall windows that looked like tired eyes. Daniel had lived there alone since his wife, Eleanor, died 7 years earlier. He never remarried. Some said he never recovered from the loss. Others said he simply preferred a quiet life. He was 61 years old, a history teacher at Gray Hollow High School, and one of the most familiar faces in town. Daniel Mercer was known for his routine. He woke up at the same time every morning, walked to the same cafe, ordered the same black coffee, and greeted the same people with the same polite smile. He arrived at school early and stayed late, often helping students who struggled or simply needed someone to listen. He never raised his voice. He never missed a day of work unless he was truly ill. Predictable, reliable, and invisible in the way only kind people sometimes are. That night, however, Daniel's routine was broken. Earlier in the evening, he had declined an invitation from a fellow teacher to join a small gathering. He said he had papers to grade. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that he sounded distracted on the phone. His voice lacked its usual calm tone, and he ended the call quickly, almost abruptly. It was the last time anyone spoke to him. Inside his house, Daniel sat alone in his upstairs study. The room was his favorite place, filled with tall bookshelves, old photographs, and a heavy wooden desk scarred with years of use. A single lamp cast a warm yellow glow across the room, lighting stacks of papers and open books. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and patient. Daniel had been reading for hours. On the desk were copies of old documents, yellowed with age, police reports, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings. Some pages were creased, others carefully flattened, as if handled many times. Daniel's glasses sat low on his nose as he leaned closer to the text, his brow tight with concentration. Every few minutes, he paused, rubbing his temples or taking a deep breath, as if the words in front of him carried more weight than paper should. As the clock downstairs ticked past 2 a.m., something shifted in the house. No one knows exactly what Daniel read in those final moments. No one knows what thought crossed his mind or what realization settled in his chest. What is known is that at approximately 2:17 a.m., a loud crash echoed through the stillness of Older Street. The sound was sharp and sudden, like furniture being thrown or something heavy striking wood. It was loud enough to wake Margaret Ellis, Daniel's nearest neighbor, a light sleeper who had lived next door for over 30 years. She sat up in bed, heart racing, listening for another sound. None came. No scream followed. No footsteps. No car starting. Just silence. Margaret considered calling the police, but hesitated. Gray Hollow was quiet. Strange noises sometimes happened. A dropped bookshelf. A fallen ladder. She told herself it was nothing and eventually lay back down, though sleep did not come easily. 30 minutes later, an anonymous call reached the local police station. The caller said only that something was wrong at Daniel Mercer's house, and then hung up. The voice was calm, almost emotionless. The number was blocked. Officers arrived at Older Street at 2:51 a.m. Their patrol car lights reflected off the snow as they pulled up in front of Daniel's house. Everything looked normal from the outside. No broken windows. No forced doors. The front porch light was off, but the upstairs study window glowed faintly, the lamp still on. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. The officers moved carefully, calling Daniel's name. There was no response. The living room was neat, untouched. The kitchen showed signs of a late-night snack, a cup of cold tea sitting on the counter, untouched for hours. They made their way upstairs. The study door was open. Daniel Mercer lay on the floor beside his desk, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His glasses were broken beneath him. A thin line of blood had dried along his temple, dark against his pale skin. His eyes were open, staring toward the doorway, wide with an expression that stopped the officers in their tracks. Faye. Not confusion. Not pain. Faye. An ambulance was called, but it was already too late. Daniel was pronounced dead at the scene. As the room filled with more officers and flashing lights, the strange details began to stand out. The desk chair was pushed back, as if Daniel had stood up suddenly. Papers were scattered on the floor, though the rest of the room remained carefully arranged. The window was open, letting in the cold winter air, but there were no footprints in the snow outside. Not a single mark disturbed the smooth white surface below. There was no weapon, no signs of a struggle, no signs of anyone else being there. The medical examiner arrived later that morning and gave a preliminary assessment. Daniel had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The injury was severe enough to be fatal, but what caused it remained unclear. There were no defensive wounds, no bruises on his arms or hands. Nothing suggested a fight. By sunrise, the news spread through Gray Hollow. Daniel Mercer was dead. People gathered in small groups outside the cafe, whispering in disbelief. Students cried in the school hallways. Teachers stood in silence, unable to understand how someone so steady, so gentle, could be gone so suddenly. The town felt off balance, like a chair missing one leg. Detectives from a neighboring county were brought in by midday. Gray Hollow had no experience with violent crime. This case demanded more than familiarity. It demanded answers. They sealed off the house and began a full investigation. Every drawer was opened, every shelf examined, every document photographed. Yet the deeper they looked, the less sense it made. There was no sign of robbery. Valuable items remained untouched. Daniel's wallet sat neatly on the desk. His phone was found in his pocket, showing no missed calls or messages after midnight. The open window remained a mystery. It was too high for someone to enter easily and too clean to suggest anyone had. Snow covered the ground below like a blank page. As the hours passed, one question echoed again and again among the investigators. If someone killed Daniel Mercer, where did they go? And if no one killed him, why did his face show terror in its purest form? By the end of the first day, Gray Hollow was no longer a town without fear. It was a town holding its breath. And this was only the beginning. By the second morning after Daniel Mercer's death, Gray Hollow no longer felt like the same town. The quiet streets were filled with slow-moving police cars, and the usual greetings at the cafe were replaced by uneasy glances and lowered voices. People spoke softly, as if the town itself might be listening. The idea that someone could die violently in a place so familiar unsettled everyone. Detective Harold Vance led the investigation. He had spent most of his career handling thefts, domestic disputes, and the occasional bar fight. A death like this was rare, and the pressure showed in the deep lines on his face. From the beginning, he believed one thing strongly. Someone else had been involved. Deaths like Daniel Mercer's did not happen without a reason. The first step was to understand Daniel's life, because crimes often grew from relationships. Vance and his team began where they always did, by speaking to the people who knew him best. At the high school, teachers gathered in the staff room, sitting stiffly as detectives asked questions. Daniel's colleagues described him in almost identical ways. Kind, quiet, reliable, someone who avoided conflict, someone who listened more than he spoke. It frustrated the investigators. People like Daniel Mercer did not fit neatly into the role of a victim with enemies. Still, the detectives pushed deeper. Laura Finch, a fellow history teacher, became the first person of interest. She had worked closely with Daniel for years, sharing lesson plans and projects. A month before his death, the two had argued during a department meeting. The argument had been over a promotion to head of department, a role Laura believed she deserved. Witnesses recalled raised voices, something rare for Daniel. When questioned, Laura appeared shaken but cooperative. She admitted the argument but insisted it had ended calmly. She said Daniel had even apologized later that same day. Phone records confirmed they had spoken briefly that evening, their conversation lasting less than 2 minutes. Laura was at home with her sister on the night Daniel died, and her alibi was solid. Security footage from a nearby grocery store showed her shopping at the time of death. The lead ended quietly. Next came the former students. Teaching for decades meant Daniel had influenced many lives, both positively and negatively. Detectives reviewed old complaints, disciplinary records, and student files. One name stood out briefly: Mark Henson, a former student who had failed Daniel's class and dropped out of school years later. Mark had once blamed Daniel publicly, claiming the failure ruined his future. When detectives found Mark, they discovered a tired man working night shifts at a factory 2 towns away. Time cards and security logs placed him at work during the early morning hours when Daniel died. He showed no anger during questioning, only sadness. He said Daniel had been strict but fair. The resentment he once felt had faded long ago. Again, nothing. Detectives spoke to neighbors next. Margaret Ellis described the crash she heard but could offer no more. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Daniel walking nervously near his mailbox days earlier, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it felt important. Investigators searched Daniel's phone and computer. Emails were polite and professional. Messages from friends were brief and ordinary. There were no threats, no heated exchanges, no signs of secret relationships or hidden conflicts. His internet history showed research, academic articles, and old historical archives. Nothing violent. Nothing personal. The lack of evidence was troubling. As days turned into a week, rumors filled the gaps left by facts. Some townspeople believed an outsider had come through Gray Hollow. Others whispered that Daniel had been involved in something he should not have been. A few even suggested suicide, though the police dismissed it quickly. Daniel's injuries did not support that theory. The pressure to find a suspect grew heavier with each passing day. Detective Vance decided to examine Daniel's past more closely. People rarely changed suddenly. If something had gone wrong, the roots might stretch back years. Investigators reviewed Daniel's life history, starting with his childhood. Daniel had grown up in Gray Hollow. His parents were well-known, respected members of the community. His father, Thomas Mercer, had worked for the town in various roles decades earlier. His mother volunteered at the library. There were no criminal records, no scandals, no stories that stood out. At least, not at first. Then one investigator noticed something unusual. Daniel had recently visited the town archive multiple times over the past month. The archive log showed his name signed in on at least 6 occasions, each visit lasting several hours. The archivist remembered him clearly. She said Daniel seemed focused, even tense. He had requested access to old police files, town council minutes, and local newspapers from the early 1980s. When asked why, Daniel had smiled and said it was for a personal research project. That answer did not sit well with Detective Vance. Why would a high school teacher suddenly become interested in decades-old police records? And why so close to his death? The detectives returned to Daniel's house to re-examine his study. They looked again at the documents on his desk. The papers were not random. They followed a pattern. Old case reports, missing persons articles, handwritten notes in the margins, questions circled in red ink, names underlined again and again. One name appeared more often than the rest. Samuel Reed. Samuel Reed had disappeared in 1983, when he was 17 years old. At the time, his disappearance had shocked Gray Hollow, but the case eventually faded into memory. The official explanation was that Samuel had run away. No body was found. No charges were filed. The case was quietly closed. Most people barely remembered it. But Daniel clearly had not forgotten. Detectives began to question why Daniel would care so deeply about a case from 40 years ago. They interviewed older residents who still remembered Samuel Reed. Stories varied. Some said Samuel was troubled. Others said he was just a restless teenager. A few recalled arguments near the river shortly before he vanished. As investigators dug into the old case, a troubling detail emerged. Daniel's father's name appeared in one of the original witness statements. Not as a suspect, but as someone present near the river on the night Samuel was last seen. The connection was distant but impossible to ignore. Detective Vance felt a shift in the investigation. What if Daniel had uncovered something dangerous? What if someone connected to Samuel Reed did not want the past reopened? The problem was time. Most of the people mentioned in the 1983 case were dead or living far away. Those still alive had no apparent connection to Daniel's final days. There were no recent communications, no meetings, no threats. The investigation seemed to be chasing a shadow. Meanwhile, the medical examiner released more detailed findings. Daniel's cause of death remained blunt force trauma to the head. The injury suggested a strong impact, but the pattern was unusual. There were no secondary injuries that typically appeared in assaults. No signs of repeated blows. Just one fatal strike. The absence of defensive wounds raised doubts among the forensic team. Detective Vance struggled with the growing uncertainty. Every instinct told him this was a homicide, but the evidence refused to cooperate. It was as if the case was deliberately avoiding clarity. Then came another strange detail. The anonymous phone call that led police to Daniel's house had been traced as far as possible. It had been made from a payphone near the old bus station, a place rarely used late at night. No cameras covered the area. No witnesses remembered seeing anyone there at that hour. The caller never came forward. The idea that someone knew Daniel was dead before anyone else disturbed the investigators deeply. It suggested presence, awareness, knowledge. Yet there was still no suspect to attach that knowledge to. As the days passed, Gray Hollow grew restless. People locked their doors more carefully. Parents kept children closer. The town wanted a name, a face, something to blame. Instead, they were given silence. Detective Vance reviewed the case files late one night, sitting alone in his office. Photographs of Daniel's study covered the desk. The open window. The scattered papers. The expression frozen on Daniel's face. That expression haunted him. Fear like that did not come from falling off a chair or tripping over a desk. It came from understanding something terrible. Something final. Vance realized the investigation might be looking in the wrong direction. What if the danger Daniel faced was not a person standing in the room? What if it was a truth he uncovered, one powerful enough to break him? The thought unsettled him. The second week ended with no arrests, no charges, and no clear path forward. Officially, Daniel Mercer's death was still under investigation. Unofficially, the case was stuck. Every suspect had faded into nothing. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. Daniel Mercer had died, and yet no one stood in the shadows to claim responsibility. Only unanswered questions remained. And somewhere within those questions lay a truth the town was not ready to face. By the third month after Daniel Mercer's death, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. Officially, the case was still active, but the energy that once filled the police station had faded. The evidence board remained mostly unchanged, photographs curling slightly at the corners, notes rewritten again and again without adding anything new. Gray Hollow wanted answers, but the case refused to give them. Detective Harold Vance felt the weight of failure more with each passing day. He had replayed the scene in Daniel's study countless times in his mind. The open window. The scattered papers. The fear frozen on Daniel's face. None of it added up. Every instinct told him something important was being missed. That something came in the form of a small detail most people had ignored. Aaron Cole was the youngest detective on the team. Fresh from a larger city, he was quiet, observant, and patient in a way that came from having something to prove. While others focused on suspects and timelines, Aaron focused on objects. He believed rooms remembered things even when people forgot. One late afternoon, Aaron returned to Daniel Mercer's house alone. The property was still sealed, silent and cold. Snow had melted by then, leaving muddy ground and bare trees. Inside, the air felt stale, heavy with the past. Aaron walked slowly through the rooms, not searching for something specific, just letting his eyes move naturally. When he reached the study, he stopped. The room looked the same as it had the night Daniel died, but something felt different. The desk had been catalogued, the shelves logged, the documents removed and stored. Yet the space still felt unfinished, like a sentence without a final word. Aaron approached the desk and crouched down, studying the lower drawers. Most had been opened and examined, but one drawer on the right side had not been pulled out fully. It was slightly ajar, almost unnoticeable. He opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies, neatly stacked and bound with a faded rubber band. The pages were old police reports, clearly copied from original files. Dates stamped at the top read 1982, 1983, and 1984. Aaron's eyes scanned the first page, then the next. His heart began to beat faster. This was not random research. The reports detailed the disappearance of Samuel Reed. Aaron took the files back to the station and laid them out on the table in the evidence room. Detective Vance joined him, leaning over the pages as Aaron explained what he had found. As they read through the reports together, the forgotten case slowly came back to life. Samuel Reed was 17 when he vanished. He was last seen near the river on the edge of town, arguing with several older men. Witness statements were vague, inconsistent, and incomplete. The investigation at the time had been poorly handled, rushed by pressure to calm the town. Within 5 years, the case was quietly closed, labeled a runaway. But the reports told a different story. Samuel had no history of running away. He had left personal items behind. His bike was found near the riverbank, undamaged. There were mentions of raised voices, threats, and a fight that may have turned physical. Yet no one was charged. No one was arrested. As Aaron turned the pages, he noticed handwritten notes in the margins. These were Daniel Mercer's notes. Questions circled in red ink. Names underlined repeatedly. Dates cross-checked against town council meetings and work schedules. Daniel had not been casually researching this case. He had been investigating it. Then they found the name. Thomas Mercer, Daniel's father. The name appeared in a witness statement, listed among a group of men seen near the river on the night Samuel Reed disappeared. At the time, Thomas Mercer had been questioned briefly and released. No further action was taken. The report stated there was insufficient evidence. Detective Vance felt a chill run through him. Daniel Mercer had been digging into a case connected to his own family. That alone explained his recent tension, his distracted behavior, and his sense of being watched. But it also raised a dangerous possibility. What if Daniel had discovered something that changed everything? The investigation shifted focus. Detectives revisited the Samuel Reed case with fresh eyes. They interviewed older residents who still remembered the boy. Some were hesitant to talk. Others seemed relieved, as if they had been waiting years for someone to ask again. A former shop owner recalled seeing Samuel arguing with men he recognized from town jobs. A retired fisherman remembered hearing shouting near the river that night. A woman who lived nearby said she had always believed Samuel had been killed but was told to stop spreading rumors. The past began to speak, but it spoke quietly. Most of the men involved were dead. Those still alive lived far away and denied everything. There was no physical evidence left. No body. No weapon. No crime scene to return to. Still, Daniel Mercer had clearly believed the truth could be found. The detectives examined Daniel's notes more closely. He had compared work schedules, weather reports, and river conditions from the night Samuel disappeared. He had marked inconsistencies in witness statements. He had written one sentence over and over again in different forms. They know what happened. But who was they? As the team searched for answers, the medical examiner requested a second review of Daniel Mercer's injuries. New forensic technology allowed for more detailed analysis, and the unusual fracture pattern had raised questions among the staff. The results came back quietly, almost casually. Daniel's head injury did not match a typical assault. The fracture suggested a single, sharp impact consistent with a fall. The angle and location aligned with the corner of his desk. There were no signs of repeated force. No bruising on his arms or hands. No evidence of restraint. Detective Vance stared at the report for a long time before speaking. If Daniel had not been struck by another person, then something else had caused him to fall. The idea was difficult to accept. It meant the investigation had been built on an assumption that might be wrong. It meant there might be no killer at all. The team reconstructed Daniel's final hours. They placed him alone in the study, reading the old reports late into the night. They imagined the moment he connected the final pieces. The realization that his father may have been involved in a young boy's death. The weight of that truth pressing down on him. Daniel had a known heart condition, something discovered in his medical records. It was controlled but not harmless. Stress could trigger severe episodes. The theory began to form. Daniel Mercer may have suffered a sudden cardiac event. His body weakened, his balance lost. He fell forward, striking his head against the desk. The impact killed him. There was no attacker, no struggle, no murder. The fear on Daniel's face was not caused by another person in the room. It was caused by understanding. Still, one question remained. If Daniel died alone, why did someone make that anonymous phone call? The answer came unexpectedly. A week later, a librarian named Helen Crowley contacted the police. She said she had found something strange while reshelving books. Tucked inside a historical journal Daniel had borrowed was a folded letter. The letter was addressed to Daniel Mercer. It was written by Sarah Reed, Samuel's younger sister. In the letter, Sarah explained that she had spent her life searching for answers about her brother's disappearance. She believed she had finally found proof that Samuel had been killed and that the people responsible were protected by silence and time. She wrote that she knew Daniel had been researching the case and wanted to meet him to share what she knew. The meeting was scheduled for the day after Daniel died. Detective Vance read the letter twice, then a third time. The handwriting was steady but emotional. Sarah did not accuse Daniel's father directly, but the implication was clear. Daniel had learned the truth alone, and it had broken him. Police tracked down Sarah Reed. She was living in another state, unaware of Daniel's death until officers contacted her. She was devastated. She said she had called the police station anonymously the night she heard about Daniel's collapse through a mutual contact. She feared being dismissed or ignored. She had not killed Daniel. She had only tried to make sure someone checked on him. With that, the final loose thread fell into place. There was no killer hiding in the shadows. There was only a man who uncovered a truth too heavy to carry. Daniel Mercer died because the past reached out and touched the present, reminding everyone that silence does not erase guilt, and time does not erase consequences. The truth had been hidden in paper for 40 years. And when it was finally read, it took a life with it. The days after Aaron Cole discovered Daniel Mercer's notes and the old Samuel Reed files marked a turning point in the investigation. Detective Harold Vance and his team were now operating with a new perspective, though the picture remained hazy. What had started as a seemingly straightforward case of suspicious death had transformed into something far more complex, and yet strangely, the complexity pointed to a conclusion no one wanted to admit. There was no killer. The shift began with the forensic re-evaluation of Daniel's injuries. The initial report had shown blunt force trauma to the head and suggested an attack, but the follow-up, conducted with more precise tools, indicated something different. The pattern of the fracture, the angle, and the way Daniel's body had landed suggested a sudden collapse rather than a blow from another person. The corner of the desk was in exactly the right position to inflict such a fatal injury if someone fell forward in a moment of weakness. The medical examiner noted no defensive wounds, no bruises on the arms or hands, and no other injuries consistent with a struggle. The realization that Daniel might have died alone forced detectives to reconsider everything. It was Aaron who first voiced the thought that had been growing in his mind. What if Daniel wasn't attacked? He said one late afternoon in the evidence room. What if he fell? What if he collapsed? His voice was careful, as though saying it aloud would make the truth too stark to bear. Detective Vance looked at him, brows furrowed, but did not interrupt. The thought had crossed Vance's mind, but now that someone else had voiced it, it seemed more than a mere theory. It demanded examination. The team reconstructed Daniel's last night hour by hour. The security cameras in the town did not cover the Mesa residence, so the reconstruction relied on indirect evidence, the position of the lamp, the desk chair, the arrangement of papers, the slight indentation of his body in the carpet, and the testimony of neighbors who remembered seeing lights in the house late at night. Aaron noted how Daniel's papers had been organized, careful stacks, some turned face down, with notes written in the margins in bold ink. The meticulousness suggested a man completely absorbed in his work, unaware of anything else in the room. It became clear that Daniel had been reading the old police reports and making notes late into the night. He had been piecing together the story of Samuel Reed's disappearance, connecting it to the only lead he could find, his father's involvement. The pressure of the discovery, combined with his known heart condition, seemed likely to have triggered a medical episode. Aaron and Vance discussed the scenario over and over. A sudden heart attack, a loss of consciousness, a fall onto the desk corner. Fatal. No one else involved. No assault. The medical report supported the theory, and gradually, even the most skeptical officers began to accept it. But accepting the mechanics of Daniel's death did not explain the expression frozen on his face, the fear that had terrified neighbors and confounded the police. Fear in the absence of a human threat is an unusual thing. What had Daniel seen? What had he realized in those final moments? The answer came from a discovery that seemed almost accidental. A local librarian, who had worked closely with Daniel on his research into historical documents, called the police to report finding a letter tucked inside a library book. It was addressed to Daniel Mercer and dated just days before his death. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, yet it carried an intensity that could not be ignored. The letter was from Sarah Reed, the sister of Samuel Reed. Sarah's letter revealed the long-standing anguish of a family whose tragedy had been dismissed and forgotten. She wrote that she had spent decades gathering information about Samuel's disappearance, and in her research, she had found documents and testimonies that corroborated what Daniel had begun to piece together. She mentioned seeing Daniel's recent visits to the archives and expressed a desire to meet him to share what she knew. Her tone was hopeful, almost relieved, because she believed Daniel might finally help her uncover the truth. The meeting, however, was never meant to happen. The letter confirmed what the forensic reconstruction had already suggested. Daniel's death was untimely, but not caused by anyone else. The fear in his expression was not of a person in the room, but of the truth he had unearthed. The knowledge of a crime that had been committed, yet never punished, and that had involved someone he had loved and trusted in his life, his own father. Police reached out to Sarah Reed to confirm the contents of the letter. She was living out of state, unaware of Daniel's passing until investigators contacted her. She was devastated. She had wanted to meet Daniel, to finally talk to someone who understood the depth of her family's tragedy, but her arrival would have been too late. She insisted she had no connection to Daniel's death and had not intended any harm. She had merely wanted to ensure that someone was looking into the case. Detective Vance summarized the situation for his team. Daniel Mesa died alone, he said quietly in the briefing room. It wasn't a murder, and it wasn't an accident in the traditional sense. It was the weight of the truth he discovered that killed him. Literally, emotionally, and physically. The statement was met with silence. Even seasoned detectives were struck by the unusual nature of the conclusion. Vance knew the challenge now lay in presenting the findings to the public. Gray Hollow was a town that craved closure in the form of a trial, an arrest, a name to blame, explaining that there was no killer, that a man had died from a combination of medical condition and overwhelming stress brought on by the discovery of a long-buried crime, would not satisfy the town's need for justice. The official report was carefully drafted. Daniel's cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, with a contributing factor of acute cardiac arrest. The circumstances surrounding the fall were detailed, including his research into historical documents, his obsession with Samuel Reed's disappearance, and the emotional strain of realizing his father's potential involvement. It was meticulous, precise, and factually accurate, but it left an unsettling void. There was no villain, no confrontation, no one to hold accountable. As the investigation closed, Detective Vance reflected on the peculiar nature of the case. He had worked on murders, assaults, robberies, and fraud, but none had ever carried the weight of unresolved truth like this one. In most cases, uncovering the perpetrator brought a sense of relief. Uncovering the truth had brought death. Daniel's meticulous research and relentless pursuit of answers had led him to the ultimate cost, yet no one had struck a blow. No one had planned a crime. The town reacted with a mixture of disbelief and unease. Families whispered about what Daniel had discovered. Students speculated about his research. Colleagues murmured about the Mercer family and long-forgotten rumors that now seemed more real than ever. The small-town dynamic shifted. Conversations that had once been ordinary now carried an undercurrent of suspicion and fear, even though there was no one to fear. Aaron Cole continued to study the documents Daniel had collected. He marveled at the teacher's dedication and determination. Daniel had not been a casual observer of history. He had been a seeker of truth, someone willing to challenge decades of silence and forgotten evidence. His notes were precise, his logic clear, and his conclusions chilling. It was evident that he had finally understood the depth of the injustice that had taken Samuel Reed's life and, indirectly, shaped the trajectory of his own family. Detective Vance occasionally visited the Mercer residence, even after the house had been cleared for sale. The study, stripped of its original contents, still carried an imprint of Daniel's presence. The arrangement of furniture, the way the desk faced the window, the small imperfections in the carpet, all of it told a story. Vance often found himself imagining Daniel sitting there, piecing together the puzzle, and then imagining the moment his body had betrayed him. The human element of the tragedy struck him harder than any crime scene he had encountered. Sarah Reed eventually returned to Gray Hollow, meeting with the police and the remaining family members of Samuel Reed. She confirmed details that Daniel had been working to verify and shared additional insights she had uncovered. While her arrival could not reverse Daniel's death, it brought some sense of completion to the story that had haunted the town for decades. The mystery of Samuel Reed's disappearance remained unresolved legally, but Daniel's research ensured that the truth, at least in part, was no longer hidden. The town of Gray Hollow began to accept the unusual conclusion. Daniel Mercer's death was mourned deeply, but there was an unspoken understanding that he had not been taken by a criminal act. Instead, his death was the consequence of bearing witness to an old, unresolved crime, a truth too heavy for one man to carry alone. Memorials were held, stories were shared, and his legacy as a seeker of justice, even in death, became part of the town's narrative. In his final report, Detective Vance reflected on the peculiar lessons of the case. He noted that not every death required a killer, not every crime had a perpetrator in the conventional sense, and sometimes the weight of truth itself could be lethal. It was a humbling revelation for law enforcement, one that challenged their understanding of human vulnerability, justice, and the intersection of past sins with present consequences. The Mercer house was eventually sold, the study repainted, and the furniture replaced. But the echo of Daniel's presence lingered in Gray Hollow, in the minds of those who had known him, and in the fragile understanding that sometimes the dead carried stories no one else could bear. The night that had changed everything did not end with a criminal in handcuffs or a court case. It ended with silence, reflection, and the sobering knowledge that some truths, once uncovered, cannot be contained, and that even in a peaceful town, the past has a way of reaching forward to claim the living. Daniel Mercer's death became a story told in whispers, a cautionary tale of obsession, courage, and the weight of knowledge. Gray Hollow moved on, but the memory of the night in the study where Daniel died alone remained vivid. People still spoke of the open window, the scattered papers, and the expression of fear frozen on his face, as if the house itself had absorbed his final realization. The town learned that sometimes the most dangerous revelations are not carried by people but by the truths they uncover, and that in some cases, there may never be a killer, because the real threat is the past itself, reaching through time to those who dare to see it. Daniel Mercer's story became a paradox, a death without a killer, a crime solved without prosecution, a life ended by discovery. And in that paradox lay the unsettling truth that would haunt Gray Hollow for generations. Justice is not always neat, and truth, no matter how long buried, carries consequences that cannot always be measured. The official closure of Daniel Mercer's case brought with it a strange, hollow feeling for the residents of Gray Hollow. It was a quiet victory for Detective Harold Vance and his team, who had worked tirelessly to uncover the facts, yet it was a closure that no one could celebrate. There was no criminal trial, no courtroom drama, no confession. There was only the sobering truth that Daniel had died alone, crushed not by a human hand, but by the weight of knowledge, the weight of truth itself. The town had hoped for a tangible resolution, something to point to, something to blame. People wanted a face to remember, a villain to hate, a justice to see fulfilled. But when the investigators presented their findings, the townspeople were met with a reality that was almost too abstract to comprehend. Daniel Mercer had not been murdered. There had been no intruder, no enemy. His death had been the tragic convergence of physical frailty, emotional stress, and an obsession with uncovering the long-buried truth about Samuel Reed. Many in Grey Hollow refused to accept it at first. Rumors flourished like wildfire. Some whispered that there had to be someone hiding in the shadows, that perhaps a distant relative of the Reed family had arrived that night, unknown to everyone, and that the investigation had missed a crucial detail. Others speculated that Daniel had been silenced for discovering something about his father that the town didn't want revealed. Mothers warned their children not to dig too deeply into old family secrets. Teachers at the high school quietly reminded students to focus on their studies, not the mysteries of the past. Detective Vance, though long accustomed to dealing with disbelief and speculation, understood the town's unease. Most crimes have a perpetrator, and justice is expected to follow. In this case, however, the perpetrator was not a person but the inescapable weight of time and truth. Daniel's meticulous research into the Samuel Reed disappearance, combined with the shocking possibility that his own father might have been involved, had created a tension too great for his body to withstand. It was a cruel, ironic twist. Daniel had sought justice for the forgotten victim, yet he had become a victim of the very knowledge he uncovered. Aaron Cole, who had first noticed the overlooked drawer in Daniel's study, spent days at the library examining the documents Daniel had gathered. Each photocopy, each handwritten note, told the story of a man consumed by the past. Daniel had carefully charted witness testimonies, compared schedules, mapped out timelines, and annotated discrepancies. He had approached the wake with the precision of a historian but the urgency of someone who believed that the truth had been intentionally hidden. Aaron felt a mixture of awe and sadness as he traced the lines of red ink, each mark a fragment of Daniel's relentless pursuit. What struck Aaron most was the human aspect of Daniel's notes. Amid the meticulous calculations and timelines, there were scribbles revealing Daniel's personal turmoil. Questions like why did father act this way? And how could they get away with this? Appeared in the margins. In some instances, Daniel had written simply, I must know the truth, as if to remind himself of the mission that had consumed his life. It was not obsession for its own sake. It was a moral imperative, a need to uncover what had been left unresolved for decades. The discovery of Sarah Reed's letter had added another layer of poignancy to the story. Sarah had spent her life searching for closure regarding her brother's disappearance, and she had identified Daniel as someone uniquely capable of piecing together the evidence. The letter had expressed hope and trust, and it had been meant to guide Daniel to the truth in a collaborative effort. Tragically, he had discovered enough on his own to know the depth of the injustice, but he had not survived to meet Sarah and share his findings. As Sarah became more involved in the aftermath, she revealed further details she had discovered in her own research. She had traced old leads, interviewed distant witnesses, and uncovered documents that supported the theory Daniel had been piecing together. Though Daniel's death meant that there would be no prosecution or legal closure, Sarah's findings ensured that the truth of Samuel Reed's disappearance was not entirely lost. For her, the case was never about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement and memory. Daniel had become an unintentional bridge between the past and the present, preserving the fragments of a story that time had tried to erase. For the police, closing the case was both a relief and a burden. There were no legal consequences to administer, but the emotional and psychological weight of the investigation lingered. Detective Vance often found himself walking past the Mercer residence, even after it had been sold. The study where Daniel had spent his final hours, the room where he had pieced together decades-old truths and faced the horrifying realization of his father's possible involvement, remained vivid in Vance's mind. He imagined Daniel at his desk, deeply absorbed in the files, feeling the slow tightening of tension in his chest that had preceded the fatal collapse. The Mercer house itself changed hands quietly. The new owners did not know the full history of the residence, only that it had been the home of a respected teacher whose life had ended tragically. They repainted the study, rearranged the furniture, and attempted to erase the echoes of the past, But for those who had known Daniel, the house could never truly be neutral. It had witnessed his final moments, the collision of discovery and mortality, and the profound silence that followed. In Grey Hollow, the story of Daniel Mercer evolved into something more than a cautionary tale. It became a legend of moral integrity, determination, and the human cost of seeking truth. People remembered Daniel not just as a teacher but as a man who dared to confront the uncomfortable, the hidden, and the painful. He had pursued knowledge with a clarity of purpose that few could comprehend, and though it had cost him his life, it had also prevented Samuel Reed's story from disappearing entirely. Students at Grey Hollow High School, who had once simply known Daniel as a quiet and fair teacher, began to learn about his final research. Teachers and staff shared the story in hushed tones, emphasizing the importance of integrity, curiosity, and moral responsibility. Daniel's life became a lesson in the power of perseverance and the potential dangers of carrying a burden alone. His dedication to uncovering the truth served as an example of intellectual rigor and courage, even in the face of overwhelming emotional strain. For the investigators, the case represented an unusual convergence of law enforcement and human tragedy. Most criminal cases focus on identifying perpetrators, gathering evidence, and ensuring justice is served. In Daniel Mercer's case, the investigators confronted a situation in which the true culprit was intangible, the past itself, and the hidden injustices that had remained unresolved for decades. They were forced to confront the idea that the discovery of truth, in some instances, carries risks no law can protect against. Detective Vance began compiling a report that was unlike any he had written before. It detailed the sequence of events leading to Daniel's death, emphasizing the physical and emotional factors that contributed to the fatal collapse. It included descriptions of the historical research, the analysis of the Samuel Reed case, and the impact of Daniel's discovery on his mental and physical state. The report avoided speculation about criminal intent, focusing instead on factual reconstruction and the lessons to be learned from the tragedy. The report concluded with a reflection on human vulnerability and the consequences of bearing knowledge alone. Daniel Mercer's death was categorized as accidental in the legal sense, but the circumstances underscored a deeper truth. Some burdens are lethal, and the pursuit of justice can carry personal costs that extend far beyond the immediate. It highlighted the moral complexity of uncovering past crimes and the tension between knowledge and personal safety. As the months passed, Grey Hollow began to adjust to the reality of the case. The town slowly returned to its routine, but the story of Daniel Mercer remained embedded in the collective consciousness. Residents spoke of him with respect, remembering the teacher who had pursued truth with relentless dedication. The mystery of Samuel Reed's disappearance, though still unresolved legally, gained new prominence. Conversations that had once been ordinary now carried an awareness of the past's weight and the responsibility of memory. Aaron Cole continued to study Daniel's research, meticulously cataloging notes, photocopies, and annotations. He marveled at the thoroughness of Daniel's work, noting the careful attention to detail, the cross-referencing of timelines, and the deliberate method of investigation. For Aaron, the experience was transformative. He had begun his career thinking of investigations purely in terms of evidence and suspects, but Daniel's case revealed the profound human dimensions of truth-seeking. It demonstrated the intersection of intellectual pursuit, ethical responsibility, and emotional vulnerability. Sarah Reed's involvement brought a sense of closure for some of the lingering questions, though the town understood that legal justice for Samuel would never occur. Her testimony confirmed Daniel's findings and validated the painstaking work he had done in the weeks leading up to his death. The collaboration between her and the authorities ensured that Samuel's story was acknowledged and preserved, even if the perpetrators remained beyond reach. In the end, Daniel Mercer's death became a story of paradox. It was a tragedy without a villain, a crime solved without prosecution, a life ended by discovery rather than malice. Grey Hollow learned that justice is not always neat, and truth is not always protective. Daniel had uncovered the past, confronted the moral failures of his family and town, and paid the ultimate price for knowledge that some would have preferred to remain buried. Memorials for Daniel were simple but heartfelt. Teachers, students, colleagues, and friends gathered at the high school and the town library to honor his dedication to truth and education. Stories were shared about his kindness, his unwavering integrity, and the quiet determination that had defined his life. People spoke of his final research with reverence, recognizing the courage it took to pursue the truth even when it was personally dangerous. Though the house was sold and repainted, the story of Daniel Mercer continued to echo through Gray Hollow. People remembered the open window, the scattered papers, the expression of fear frozen on his face, and the legacy of a man who had dared to confront the past. He became a symbol of the intersection between history, morality, and human vulnerability, a reminder that some truths, no matter how long hidden, cannot remain buried forever. Gray Hollow eventually accepted the unusual conclusion. The town had no killer to fear, no trial to follow, no courtroom drama to obsess over. Instead, the residents were left with reflection and remembrance. Daniel Mercer's story emphasized the fragility of human life, the moral weight of knowledge, and the unpredictable consequences of seeking justice. It was a story that would linger, passed down in whispers, lessons, and memories for generations to come. The case closed without a killer, yet it remained one of the most haunting episodes in Gray Hollow's history. The town had learned that danger does not always come in the form of a person. Sometimes, it comes in the shape of truth itself, capable of breaking even the strongest among us. Daniel Mercer's death was a testament to courage, curiosity, and the unyielding pursuit of knowledge, a story of heroism entwined with tragedy. In quiet moments, long after the investigation ended, residents would recall Daniel's study, the meticulous notes, the letter from Sarah Reed, and the documents detailing Samuel Reed's disappearance. They understood that Daniel had become more than a teacher or a victim. He had become a guardian of truth, a man who faced the past head-on and paid the ultimate price for it. Gray Hollow moved on, but the memory of Daniel Mercer lingered. His story remained a somber reminder that sometimes, the most profound dangers are not human, and the most devastating losses are the ones carried in silence. Daniel's pursuit of justice and truth had created ripples that extended far beyond his life. And even in death, he had ensured that the forgotten would not be erased entirely. The town never forgot him, and in remembering, they preserved a cautionary truth, that some cases do not end with vengeance, that some crimes leave no one to punish, and that the past, no matter how long buried, can still reach forward to touch the living. Daniel Mercer's life and death became intertwined with the history he had loved and studied, a permanent testament to the power of knowledge and the price that sometimes comes with uncovering it. In the end, Gray Hollow understood what had happened, though understanding did not bring comfort. The death of Daniel Mercer remained tragic, mysterious, and haunting. It was a reminder that the human pursuit of truth can be both noble and perilous, that courage comes with cost, and that even the most careful investigation cannot prevent all consequences. And so, the town carried on, the story of Daniel Mercer a permanent shadow over the quiet streets. A case that had ended in silence became a story that would never truly end. The life of a man who had sought justice for a forgotten boy became a legacy of remembrance, an enduring lesson in morality, perseverance, and the delicate balance between knowledge and mortality. Gray Hollow had no killer, yet the past had spoken, and it had claimed a life to ensure its secrets would be remembered forever.